government policy making and business decision making. And today, really, we're very fortunate to have a speaker who can speak about the future of energy. I'm reminded about Yogi Berra's famous quote on predictions. It's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. What other predictions are there? But I cannot think about a field that's harder to predict than the field of energy. As you all know, there are major geopolitical changes, swings in oil prices, socioeconomic pressures, and depending on which side of the continent you're in or which part of the world you're in, the conditions are very different. And of course, technology plays a huge role. I was reminded just 5 years ago, when I was in the government, there were all kinds of incentives trying to drive down the price of solar panels and funding for technology in the solar energy business. And they were shooting for a 10-year steady state of 10 cents per kilowatt hour for solar energy. And now, because of technological advances, it's down to 5 or 6 cents, depending on which part of the world you're looking at. So it's just very hard to predict where things are going. And today, we're really very fortunate to have Dr. Ralph Izzo, who can speak to all of this. But it's not my privilege and honor to introduce him. That honor and pleasure goes to my colleague, Professor Rob Karpik, the John Henry Town Professor and the Chair of Mechanical Engineering and Applied Mechanics. So please join me in welcoming Rob to the stage.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and it's wonderful to see this great turnout. And I'm fortunate to have the privilege and honor to introduce Dr. Ralph Izzo. He was elected Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Public Service Enterprise Group in April 2007. PSEG, as it's known, it's headquartered in New Jersey. It's one of the 10 largest electric companies in the US and is very diversified, and the history is interesting to read on the website. It goes back to the previous turn of the century, 2 turns of the century ago. So Ralph has a very broad portfolio and experience. He was named the company's president and chief operating officer and a member of the board of directors in October 2006. Previously, he was the chief operating officer of PSE&G, the Public Service Electric and Gas Company, which he joined in 1992. He has a tremendous vocation for service and dedication to the community and to higher education. He serves on the board of directors of the New Jersey Chamber of Commerce, the Edison Electric Institute, the Nuclear Energy Institute, and the New Jersey Performing Arts Center. He's also on the advisory board for the Mechanical Engineering and Applied Mechanics here at Penn. And this has been, in particular, a great privilege and benefit to us. And so I've had the opportunity to interact directly and to have conversations about education, the present and future state of education, and where industry and technology needs are. And so we have benefited, and the students of MEME are benefiting from Ralph's insights. So thank you in particular for your service on our board. We really appreciate that. He is also a member of the Board of Trustees of the Petty School and Princeton University's Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment, their advisory council. He's also a member of the visiting committee for the Nuclear Engineering Department at MIT. He's the CEO and the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. He is a former member of Columbia University's School of Engineering Board of Visitors. That's his school where he graduated from with his degrees. He is a former chair of the Rutgers University Board of Governors and the New Jersey Chamber of Commerce. So with that breadth of experience and breadth of commitment, please join me in welcoming Ralph Izzo.
So I'm told the mic is live. Can you hear me? Is that great? Great. Okay. And this is a fabulous turnout. I understand that some of you were forced to come, and then there were chocolate chip cookies for the rest of you. Is that the idea here? Okay. All right. And full confession, my daughter's a student here. I see some of her roommates, so I will try not to embarrass her in her absence. And it is amazing. She's not here because she has a class, and I was sure she would not honor my request. So I'm delighted to see that I still have some sway with her, although please don't tell her I said that. How many folks live in New Jersey? normally? Oh, a few. Okay, it's about maybe a handful. And are you customers of PSEG? Okay, so the other 98% of you have no idea who PSEG is. So 2 shameless slides before we get into the rest of the presentation. And I will tell you, there will not be anything that resembles an equation, yet this is what most of us in the business world consider a technically sophisticated presentation. So this will not be too challenging for early morning or for any time of day. So PSEG really consists of 3 companies. On the far left, you see a map of where we serve our customers electricity and natural gas. It's about 2 million of each. And that is literally just a regulated set of pipes and wires, and you'll hear me refer to it in that way. In the middle is a description of our competitive power generation business. On the left side, you see a pie chart that shows you by nameplate capacity. So if you look at our hardware, this is what that hardware is capable of producing in terms of megawatts, and you see that we are about equally natural gas and nuclear, and then a distribution of solar and coal and some other fuels that we are capable of producing electricity using. The pie chart on the right says this is how often the plants actually run. And what you see is that nuclear runs a disproportionate share of the time compared to what it's capable of doing. It runs about 92% of the time. Natural gas, a little bit less, and solar and those other technologies, even less than what they're capable of doing. I'd ask you to just think about those 2 pie charts because we're going to make use of them in a moment. Anyone here from Long Island? A couple people. We operate the electric system on Long Island, even though we don't own that electrical system out on Long Island. They are a tough group of customers. I have a sister-in-law who lives out there. She's legally insane. And every once in a while, she will call me and tell her lights are out. I say, okay, just wait a second. I'll get my boots on. I'll come out there and help you in just a moment. Even though 98% of you have never heard of us, we're a Fortune 200 company, about $40 billion worth of assets. If you look at us in terms of market cap, worth about $30 billion in the market. As Professor Carpenter mentioned, we're one of the 10 largest electric utilities in the nation. There are about 100 electric utilities in the nation who claim to be among the 10 largest. And none of them are lying. It all depends on what measure you use. In our particular case, it would be by profitability and market cap. Last of the shameless self-promotion slides, despite the fact that I'm sure the Wharton School is teaching all of you that you are in existence only for the benefit of your shareholders, we have a slightly different point of view at PSEG, which is that the best way to reward your shareholders is by paying very careful attention to the communities you serve, the customers you serve, and the employees who make sure that you deliver on those promises to those customers and those shareholders. So we have a range of awards that we win on a regular basis, from Diversity Inc. to Dow Jones Sustainability Index and a variety of others. All right, so end of shameless promotion. Now, to talk about electricity supply and use today and tomorrow, we have to understand the past a little bit. So on the far left, what you see is a 3-year rolling average of GDP growth in the reddish purple color, and then a rolling 3-year average of electricity growth in the black. And you could see that about 60 or 70 years ago, when we were a highly industrialized, manufacturing-focused economy, electricity growth far and away outstripped growth in GDP. As the economy moved from this industrial set of parameters to more of a service-oriented economy, then you could see around the 1980s and 1990s, GDP growth and electricity growth were one and the same. As we have continued this service growth, and as we've moved to much more efficient building envelopes and appliances, electricity growth has lagged substantially below the growth in GDP. On the right, we try to show just some of the major electricity-using appliances in the home and that consumers rely upon. Please note the difference in scales between the television set and the computer and the air conditioner and refrigerator. So even if you are the worst consumer on the face of the planet, when you go out and replace that 15 and 20-year-old refrigerator or air conditioning unit, you are greatly reducing your electricity demand. Now, over the course of those 15 years, you've added 2 or 3 smartphones, half a dozen iPads, a larger television set, and a variety of things that you simply cannot live without if the electricity goes out. And I have proposed in every one of my speaking engagements, and I do invite people to give me a different example, that makes electricity quite unique. It is the one thing I can think of where we're using less of it, even as we become more dependent on it. And that offers tremendous challenges for public policy implications about how one regulates electricity, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So Much slower growth in demand of electricity, driven by structural changes in the economy, and then just advances in technology on major electricity-using devices. What does that mean? Well, it took us a while to figure that out. On the left side are projections of how electricity demand would grow. Notice there's a suppressed zero there, so it's not quite as bad as I'm about to explain. And you see back in 2008, an entity that is in charge of predicting how much electricity supply is needed in a 13-state region called Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland. Yes, it's a 13-state region named after the 3 states because they were the original 3 founding states. We thought in 2008 that that would grow as that top dark line suggests. Then in 2009, we said, okay, it's not going to grow quite as fast, and we drew the second line right below that. In 2010, we drew the third line, and so on and so on and so on. Now, those predictions are matched by the fact that the actual growth in electricity is the black line on the bottom. So what you could see there is that not only did demand for electricity not increase, but it actually declined. And it wasn't until 2018, the dotted red line, that we threw the towel in and said, okay, this is a trend that's going to continue. Now, the PJM region tends to be, as I said, this 13-state region that starts in New Jersey, moves west to Pennsylvania, south to Maryland and Delaware, and goes as far as Illinois. The implications of these projections and the lack of realization for those projections resulted in a tremendous overbuild of electric supply. Now, what kind of electric supply does one need to meet the needs of customers? Let's just take a look at 2 typical days in the consumption of electricity. On the top, you see a typical winter day in this region of the country. On the bottom, you see a typical summer day. And not surprisingly, it's a fairly flat demand curve in the winter with a little bit of a peak when people are waking up and therefore using some electricity to begin their day. And then a fairly flat lighting load throughout the day, but one that gets a little bit higher because some folks are still home while the buildings are turning on. Then it stays flat during the middle of the day, and then it goes up a little bit in the evening as some folks go home, but the lights don't go out in the commercial buildings that tend to dominate this part of the country. So fairly flat with 2 slight peak demand periods in the morning and in the afternoon as residential consumption overlaps with business consumption. A very different picture in the summertime, where you have the lower usage at night, demonstrated by the left part of that curve, and then an increase as folks begin to wake and businesses turn on and begin to condition the air associated with the summer heat. And of course, reaching a peak in the late afternoon after all that thermal inertia has had a chance to build up in the home and in the business. So 2 very different profiles at different times of the year, and there is a gradual shift from one to the other as we go through spring and fall. What that means is that there are a different amount of power that needs to be turned on at 4 a.m. on that summer day than at 6 p.m. on that summer day. And in fact, some plants will run all day long, and other plants will only run for part of the day. So what we do is we segment that demand curve into 3 pieces. Base load, plants that run throughout the day all year long. They tend to be plants with the lowest operating cost. Right? So in an environment where we want to run power plants and save consumers as much money as possible, there's no sense crying over spilt milk. So whatever it costs to build a plant is irrelevant. That money is gone. So the only question is, what does it cost to produce the next kilowatt, the next megawatt of power? So we dispatch our plants on a short-run marginal cost basis, which would be the slide on the right. And there are some plants that, as I said a moment ago, run round the clock. They would be our baseload plants. There are some plants that run most of the day. That would be the blue section, our intermediate plants. And there are some plants that you just turn on for a few minutes a day. And those would be our peaking plants. Not surprisingly, the most efficient plants are baseload. The least efficient plants are the peaking. Unfortunately, Mother Nature seems to have a sense of humor. The most expensive plants to build are those baseload plants, the ones that are most efficient. The cheapest plants to build are the peaking plants, the ones that are most expensive to operate. Right? So you just sort of slap up a peaking plant because you think demand is going up, and you build a baseload plant only when you think it's going to be needed for the next 40 years. And we actually run discounted cash flow analyses over the next 40 years. When do we think that those paybacks will actually, when do we think that those investments will actually pay themselves back? Any guesses as to when my team runs a discounted cash flow analysis of a power plant investment for 40 years? when we will break even? Throw out a number. 12 years? More? 20? More? Yeah, 26 years. We're making stuff up. No spreadsheet is going to be accurate for a 26-year discounted cash flow analysis. Right? There are some macro assumptions that one makes, and you hope for the best. But if we look at the short-run marginal cost, now it's a little tough to see all these different technologies squished into a slide here on the right. But what we're showing is that if the demand in this region was for 50,000 megawatts, then all the plants to the left would be asked to run. And what you see that dominated by is wind, solar, and nuclear power. Those are the cheapest plants to produce the next kilowatt. Now, the sun and the wind are free. Converting that to electricity is expensive. Nuclear fuel is inexpensive. Building the power plant to run it is very expensive. So I'm not showing the capital cost here. I'm not showing the construction cost here. And then as you move further to the right, if the demand was 100,000 megawatts, you start seeing a little bit more of natural gas plants coming into play and more coal plants coming into play. If the demand ever got north of 150,000 megawatts or close to 200,000 megawatts, we are basically running a bunch of tractor engines. These are diesel engines powered, fueled by oil. And you never want to get there. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten there since 2006. But these are extremely inexpensive things to have around in various load pockets to make sure the lights don't go out. So what does that mean? To show you what the national picture looks like in terms of nameplate capacity versus what's actually produced, it's not that dissimilar than what we have at PSEG. You see a fair amount of natural gas. You see coal is number 2, nuclear is number 3, hydro a dominant factor, very regionally driven, and a growth in wind energy. But when you look at what is actually being produced, you see that nuclear disproportionately produces more. Natural gas, which is the fuel of choice that we'll talk about in a moment, fuels 2 different types of power plants. It fuels that very efficient load-following plant that I alluded to earlier. It also fuels some of the inexpensive peaking plants. So there's a blend of 2 different technologies in natural gas. Coal tends to be far more baseload, and therefore you see that its output exceeds its nameplate capacity. And you could see that solar and wind, because of their lack of predictability or their diminished predictability in terms of how and when they can run, tend to produce less electricity than they are capable of. Now, how did that picture evolve over the past 10 or 15 years? What you see is that the middle, the dark part of the bar, was coal, which was by far the dominant source of electricity in the nation, has decreased greatly over time for 2 reasons. I'll mention one here, and then I'll show you some slides on the second reason. The number 1 reason being environmental regulation. Coal is an abundant and inexpensive fuel. The problem is it has literally every element in the periodic table inside of it. And as you put it through a combustion process, some of those things get into the air, and that's not a good place to be. And then a strong growth in natural gas, and also some growth in renewables, the green up on top. Now, why has that happened? For 2 reasons. As I said, one is environmental regulation and advances in the cost of renewable energy. And in fact, today, depending on where one is in the country, onshore wind farms are as competitive as the lowest cost fossil fuel alternative, which would be a natural gas combined cycle turbine. Coal is much more expensive nowadays because of the costs associated with environmental control. And you can see that utility scale photovoltaics are still relatively expensive compared to wind and natural gas, but certainly becoming much more competitive than they were before. A new nuclear plant would be an extremely expensive option. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the gas peakers, which used to be inexpensive to build and still are inexpensive to build because they're so inefficient, their levelized cost of energy, what you would have to get paid over the life of that plant, is rather high, which is why it only runs at the peak. Offshore wind, that's a fairly generous characterization. We'll see in a few minutes that we don't have a lot of experience with offshore wind in the US. So there are some big error bars around that particular estimate there. Now, all of these estimates are what it would cost under current regulation. So there are 2 huge missing components to these estimates. Component number one for the fossil-fueled power supplies is the absence of any externality. So we're not burdening the natural gas plant or the coal plant with the cost of carbon. We're not burdening them with the cost of SO2. We're not burdening them with the cost of NOx. Similarly, renewable generation under current technology could not be used to power the entire grid because of its lack of dispatchability. You would have to burden it with some storage costs to make sure that the power is available to meet the demands throughout those two charts that I showed earlier, a typical winter and a typical summer day. So in addition to the reduction in cost of renewables, what's been going on that natural gas has been growing so strong and coal has been coming down as per the chart 2 slides ago. Here I'm showing you the cost of natural gas versus the cost of coal from 2005 to today. If you look at the left side of the slide, what you see is that natural gas was extremely expensive compared to coal, number one, and number two, very susceptible to supply disruptions. You see a couple of hurricanes and storms that hit the Gulf Coast region, and that being where our primary supply of natural gas was coming from, resulted in huge spikes during these two weather events. Now then the phenomena took place in 2008, and I'm sure many of you are thinking that was the Great Recession. It was partly the Great Recession, but also it was the explosion in technological capability of extracting natural gas from shale deposits. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides. But basically, if you would think about the way in which we used to extract natural gas from underground deposits, the way I think of it is take this stage and put a cup of coffee on it, and then take a drill up in the ceiling and try to make sure that that drill from the ceiling hits that cup of coffee. Not easy to do. I mean, lots of sophisticated technology to help one do it a little bit better. Shale gas and hydraulic fracturing have said kick that cup of coffee and let that coffee fall all across the stage and do the same drilling. And the chances of hitting that are much greater, and in fact, one can then horizontally extract the gas that exists across the stage in the form of, in this particular metaphor, coffee. Now, so that revolution in technology drove the price of natural gas down to be competitive with coal. And equally important, was no longer susceptible to the supply disruptions. Who cares if there's a hurricane in the Gulf Coast if my natural gas is coming from 2,000 feet underground in Pennsylvania? What it is vulnerable to is some disruptions in demand. Natural gas is the #1 fuel used to heat the home. So to the extent that you have a polar vortex, which is an extremely cold weather event, then the price of natural gas did spike to 50% above coal. So let's talk about that shale gas. As you can see, the top part of the curve on the left, it really did come into prominent view around 2008 and has continued to grow and is expected to dominate the U.S.'s natural gas production for many years to come. Where is that shale gas located? Primarily in the eastern United States. That would be western New York, western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio. There is quite a bit in the Texas area and to a lesser extent the rest of the country. How plentiful and how expensive is it? It actually is so inexpensive that a good part of our natural gas costs negative amounts to extract from underneath the Earth's surface. How can that be possible? Any ideas how it can be a negative cost to extract natural gas?
It costs more to shut down production than it does to run it?
It's close. It's actually a waste product when you're extracting $80 a barrel for oil. So in some southern parts of the country where oil is the hydrocarbon that you're pursuing, I am burning my retina under this light. I don't know why I'm standing here. When oil is the fossil fuel that one is extracting, literally it's an associated outcome of that drilling procedure, you're paying to either flare the gas or package it and send it somewhere else. So it's viewed as a negative cost. It's sort of a side benefit, if you will, or you just flare it away. These dollar values are in nominal terms, so these are not even real dollars. So you could see out until the year 2040, we are looking at gas prices of about $3 per MMBTU. If I just go back here for a moment, you see that that will be competitive with coal, with a far better environmental footprint, fingerprint out for another 30 years or so, 20 years, and then out beyond that time as well. I used to have a slide that I no longer bring to these presentations, which is not that dissimilar from the pathetic set of projections I showed you before about what electricity supply would be and what the actual turned out to be. Remember all those graphs that pointed it going up and then the actual was going down? The mirror image of that is our projections of how much gas we have left keep showing this rise and then a flattening. And then when you connect those projections for the actual, what you see is an exponential growth as we've gotten better at extracting it from the ground and understanding where it exists. Now, so we have this oversupply condition and this abundant natural gas, yet we have a growth in renewables. So the offshore wind, the onshore wind number looked like it might be competitive, but why bother, right? I mean, it's tough to cite, it's very geographic specific, and the reason is that many states have mandated the construction of renewables, and it ranges all over the map. Hawaii is not shown here. They have a mandate of 100%, and as you can see, the southeastern part of the United States, in some cases, there's no mandate at all. But some states such as California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Hawaii are rather aggressive in their ambitions for renewable energy. And part of it is possible by the decline in cost, for example, in solar panels. There's a similar decline in cost for wind turbines and their capability of producing electricity. In fact, in the case of solar now, I think we're not going to see meaningful reductions in solar prices unless we do a better job on what we call the balance of plant. So it's not so much about the panel, but everything that connects the panel to the grid, and unless we start doing something about the efficiency of each panel. So declining costs for renewable technology, coupled with state mandates to build more renewables, are driving the increased use of renewables, despite the fact that demand for this electricity is going down. So you have the supply-demand growing imbalance. The only way this happens is through subsidies. I'm going to show you a little bit of a breakdown of how New Jersey pays for solar electricity. So New Jersey has Bruce Springsteen. It has the Giants, sadly, nowadays, but it does not have a lot of sun. And when you look at the cost of what electricity would be in New Jersey, 31 cents per kilowatt hour. The typical wholesale power price for electricity is about 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's a factor of 10 more expensive than what one would normally pay if you just purchase electricity on the wholesale power market. And you see it broken down into various subsidies. SREC stands for Solar Renewable Energy Credit. ITC, that's a state subsidy. ITC stands for Investment Tax Credit. That's a federal subsidy. Net metered is a state subsidy. I won't bore you with the details. But then the value of the energy, I said 3 cents. I should have said 4 cents per kilowatt hour. You add that up and you get 37 cents per kilowatt hour. So we are actually subsidizing solar energy more than we need to in New Jersey. And to add insult to injury, who are we subsidizing it for? This is the average, the median income of net metered solar customers in our territory. The New Jersey median net income is $72,000 a year. We tend to be the second or third wealthiest state in the nation, usually trailing Connecticut and Maryland. And in the U.S. median household income, I think that's an old number. It's now higher. I think it's closer to $60,000 a year. So you basically have the investment tax credit flowing from those $53,000 a year customers to this $110,000 a year customer, and then the net metering subsidy and the SREC subsidy flowing from these $72,000 a year customers to these $110,000 a year customers. So a very regressive subsidy. This is not to be misconstrued as a criticism of the need to subsidize or the benefit of subsidizing. It is a criticism of the way in which the subsidy flows, however. One of the things I've noticed in my travels and trying to attract folks to our industry, we do get a tremendous amount of interest on the part of folks who are interested in the nexus between environmental, social, and energy policy, because it is a highly regulated industry with a tremendous amount of complexity associated with achieving some long-term objectives like carbon reduction through some type of financial incentive system that doesn't do this type of thing where you have subsidies flowing from those who make less to those who make more. The next big wave in renewable energy, I believe, on the East Coast will be offshore wind. Each of these circles represents proposed projects up and down the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region. You could see from the table in the upper right that there's about close to 8,500 megawatts of proposed projects in operation today are about 30 megawatts, so our aspirations are much bigger than what we currently do. That 30 megawatt project was built at a cost of about $250 per megawatt hour. So that's about the same price as that rooftop solar slide that I showed before. Fortunately, subsequent projects, as they've been bid, have seen that price go from $250 to $160 to the most recent solicitation in Massachusetts being $80 a megawatt hour. So the price curve is coming down for those projects, and we think that it will continue to drop. There's a lot that is unknown about learning what has been done in the North Atlantic, in the North Sea, in Europe, and applying that here in the States. What we view as shallow water is anywhere from 150 to 200 feet. What they have viewed as shallow water is typically 30 to 50 feet, nor do they have the type of hurricane risk that we have in this part of the country. So just some operational challenges, some real engineering challenges going forward. No, a hurricane is not good for a wind farm. Spinning that blade faster and faster is not what you want to see happen, right? So there are some misconceptions out there about, if normal weather's good, then having 110 mile an hour wind would be even better. It's not the case. States are beginning to realize that with the kind of penetration they are encouraging in renewable energy, that having storage to go along with it is equally important. The map is not quite as filled in as the Renewable Portfolio Standard map was, but you can see a fair amount of interest on the east and west coast for storage through accompanying battery technology. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about public policy and how it can have the best of intentions but not necessarily get you where you want to be. Due to the absence of a comprehensive and rational structure on what problem we want to solve, let me suggest that a problem we should want to solve is reducing the amount of CO2 that we inject into the atmosphere. And that would apply for methane and various other greenhouse gases as well. In the absence of a federal program for that, in the absence of an international program that we are not abiding by, I think there was two negatives there, I should have said, in the absence of an international program that we are abiding by, there's the Paris Treaty, but we're not abiding to it. States have taken it upon themselves to emphasize these renewable portfolio standards and these battery storage standards. I'm showing you here a picture of what many view to be the leading state in terms of environmental progressivity, and that would be California. On the left, you see the price of electricity in California compared to the price of electricity in New Jersey going back 10 years. I am not someone who worries about increasing the cost of electricity if it makes sense to do that in terms of the environmental benefits or the quality of service that you deliver to the customer. It makes perfect sense. I think we don't pay enough for our energy in this country, and in fact, that's because of these externalities not being priced in. But notice the price of electricity going up by about a third in California, and the price of electricity in New Jersey coming down about 10%. It's probably not easy to see that 10%, but that is largely driven by the decline in natural gas prices. Now, if you look at the slide on the right, what you see is the carbon dioxide per megawatt hour produced in the two states. And you see New Jersey and California started at about the same place. New Jersey has slowly drifted down. California's had a little bit more of an uneven movement. I'm going to direct your attention to 2 years, 2011 and then 2016 through 17. The jump up in 2011 in California was due to the retirement of a nuclear plant, the San Onofre plant, and the replacement of that nuclear plant basically with natural gas. And you could see the electric sources, this is the sources of electricity on the bottom two charts. Probably tough to read from there. The decline in carbon emissions over the past few years, one would think, is driven by the growth in renewable energy in California, but in fact it is not. It is driven by the fact that there's been a restoration and a tremendous amount of growth in hydropower electricity in California. To be sure, the growth of solar, the yellow and the growth of green wind, has been helpful in California, but over the last 3 years, you see a growth of about 30 million megawatt hours in terms of hydropower and a growth of about 8 million, so a factor of 4 difference due to the growth of solar and wind. So you have an example where instead of focusing on the problem, CO2, and choosing the technologies, yes to wind, yes to solar, great stuff, but no to nuclear, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot. And I worry about this across the country What you see here are just small pictures of nuclear power plants that have either retired, the black ones, that have announced they're going to retire, the red ones, and a few that were on the verge of retiring but got saved by some subsidy mechanism in the state, the green. And if you just look at the red and the black, you see an awful lot of pictures there. And then I point your direction to how many new nuclear plants are being built. And here I show two, but in fact, the one that looks like it's in Tennessee was under construction years ago, and it's just restarted its construction. I doubt that that would have happened or not started back in the early 90s. So you could see that the future of nuclear is very much in question in the United States, and that does have significant implications for carbon. So one other area of tremendous investment in our electricity system going forward is to digitize the grid. We have a fairly unsophisticated grid as one gets closer to the customer. Many of you may not realize this, but if you're out of power and you live in New Jersey, I have no idea. Unless you call me up and say I'm out of power, we don't know that you're without electricity. We have a lot of sophisticated technology around our nuclear plants, somewhat slightly less sophisticated, but still fairly sophisticated around our transmission assets. But as we get closer and closer to the customer, our technology gets dumber and dumber. In fact, we still have to send a human being out once a month to read the meter to see how much energy you've consumed. The ability to help people use their energy more intelligently will be greatly enhanced by investments that are being made throughout the industry in what's called two-way customer communication. That's the ability to put a device on the home that can send price signals to customers, read their consumption, not just once a month, but once an hour, once every 10 minutes, to see how their demand is changing based upon extreme weather conditions primarily. So you could see here the rise in these advanced metering devices in the dark blue line and the decline in the less sophisticated devices in the dashed black line. Many states, in fact, are demanding that people install this, and I think this will be extremely beneficial as we move away from large central station power capability and we move more towards distributed power capability, such as rooftop solar, as prices continue to decline. The other area of significant investment in the industry is in just hardening the grid, recognizing that there is this increased dependency upon electricity, and people simply cannot live with that power for months at a time. How many of you remember something called Superstorm Sandy? 2012, yeah, okay. So that was 2 weeks of very challenging times for us as a company. I remember sitting in our control room with the head of my utility, and all of the models said that we were in for a miserable time. And about 6 p.m. that night, we were still relatively unscathed. And we thought, okay, we dodged this bullet. At about 6:30, the storm center made a sharp left turn, as predicted by, I believe, only one meteorological model at the time, and came ashore at a place called Toms River, New Jersey. In the span of a half an hour, we lost 90% of our customers. And that was the beginning of an amazing 2-week period. I'll never forget, within 24 hours, I was on the phone with President Obama. I wasn't alone. It was me and a couple of the CEOs who were primarily affected. And he wanted to know when would we get the refineries back in the New Jersey area, because that was the supply chain for gasoline. How are we doing with getting Newark Airport back, one of the 5 busiest airports in the nation? Candidly, how were we in some of our urban centers where there was concern about personal security? A day later, I was on the phone with one of his national security advisors. He was flying into New Jersey, having the same conversation. 2 days later, I remember sitting in our control room, and one of the head of our utility operations received a phone call on his cell phone, and the caller ID said it was from a major hospital in Newark. And he was a little surprised. He was concerned for his family, of course, at first. He picked it up, and the person he was speaking to was a doctor at the hospital. And he had seen our news releases saying that we were restoring critical customers first. And critical customers were emergency services, hospitals, and they were not restored yet. And this was day 3 or 4 of the storm. And he had 3 cases of elective surgery to do that day, and he wanted to know whether or not we'd get his power back. Literally, lives were hanging in the balance. They had backup generators, but he was uncomfortable doing these surgeries on that, so we promised we'd get him back. And this continued. About 2 weeks into the storm, I received an email from a parent, and it was very, very nicely worded. It began with, "I know you've been busy. I've seen all the news reports. I hear the progress you're making, and I think it's wonderful. but if you don't get my power back in the next 5 hours, I am sending my teenager to live with you. And I tell that story because there is no doubt in my mind that, okay, maybe it was day one for President Obama, maybe it was week number 2 for Mrs. Jones, I don't remember her name, we'll call her Mrs. Jones. But at that point in time, they were equally at wit's end about what needed to be done. Now, in one case it took 2 weeks, in another case it took a few hours. Now, the challenge is that these investments are really expensive in terms of hardening the grid and making it resilient to a Superstorm Sandy so you don't have 2 weeks worth of damage. Let me ask you, in all honesty, how many people woke up this morning and said, I can't wait to use a kilowatt hour? All right. I live and die by how many kilowatt hours you use, and I didn't wake up this morning saying I can't wait to use a kilowatt hour. How many of you pay any attention to your electric utility? Really? When? When the bill comes, right? When's the other time you pay attention? When you're without power. Now, how many of you, when you are without power, say, I wish my bill was higher so they could have improved the power grid? All right, so it's an honest group you have here, Dean Kumar. That's great. So the public policy implications of that are, how do I convince people that they need to pay more for electricity when, for the most part, it is something they never pay attention to, and the 2 times they pay attention to it, they are really mad. There is no solution to that. It's just an issue that exists right now in the system. I've listed here a bunch of programs that we have underway. In the next 5 years, we will spend $15 billion on various technologies to do everything from minimize methane leakage into the atmosphere to building more rigorous standards around the construction of our poles and wires. So last topic, and then open it up for questions if there are any. My favorite topic, and one that is least discussed, the low-hanging fruit of energy efficiency. We are the worst, or one of the worst. I think we rank number 10 in terms of, if you look at our national standards around things that can be done to reduce energy consumption. And it's building standards, it's appliance standards, it's various tools that other countries use to make sure that people use only the electricity they need, right? Go back to the question of 3 minutes ago. Did anybody wake up saying that they wanted to use a kilowatt hour today? Of course not. Maybe you're looking forward to seeing some movie tonight. Maybe you're looking forward to hosting some friends and you're going to use your gas stove. You're going to do things and you're looking forward to do things that are enabled by the consumption of electricity and natural gas, but the consumption of electricity and natural gas are not by any means an end in and of themselves. So the left chart should look a little bit familiar. I took GDP off. I'm still showing electricity growth. But look at the right chart. Other than Canada, which has a very different spread of climate in terms of its impacted citizens, we are the highest energy per capita user in the planet, far higher than the OECD members, far higher than Japan, Germany, and France. Now, the chart would look a little different if I looked at energy consumption per dollar of GDP. We would look a little better. But basically, we're pigs. That doesn't change, right? So we come down a little bit, but by and large, we're just tremendous users who don't care. Now, why is that the case? What does the average person spend on electricity and natural gas bill in the course of a month? The answer is between 2% and 3%. If you're a wealthy individual, your wealth tends to outpace your usage of electricity, so that percentage drops. So it really is something you pay zero attention to. If you're a not so wealthy individual, in fact, you're below the median income, that 2 or 3% can climb to 6, 7, 8%. And it matters and you want to do something about it, but energy efficiency tends to be a significant upfront investment for a longer-term payback. So those who need it don't have the resources to pay for it, and those who have the resources to pay for it could care less about it. So there are structural reasons why we don't do much in energy efficiency. One of the things we can do is charge people more for their electricity. Here you see a distribution of different rates around the country. That would be the bar chart. And as you can see that there is some correlation as prices go down, then the box, the dialog box, says how much is the average kilowatt hour usage by people living in that region. And generally, the lower the price, the more people use. If we were to put the cost of externalities, pick your externality, my favorite is carbon, on top of these bills, we might get some market-driven reduction in in energy consumption. But again, there are those dislocations that I mentioned a moment ago that will limit that somewhat. Various folks have done analysis of how much energy we can save. It is literally a walk in the park to reduce our electricity demand by about 10%. Technically, we could do it by 30%, but some of those decisions would imply that we're willing to pay a certain price to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, the amount of SO2 in the atmosphere, the amount of NOx in the atmosphere. People may or may not be willing to do that, but nonetheless, between 10 and 30% reduction in electricity is quite doable in our nation. If I take that slide that I showed you earlier about what it costs to build a combined cycle unit, to build a coal unit, a nuclear unit, and I show you what energy efficiency estimates are, you can see that it is by far the least expensive way to manage our electricity needs in the nation. Now, that's a little bit unfair, right? I'm obviously only showing there some of the low-hanging fruit, which would be lighting systems and heating systems. There are some energy efficiency investments that would be more expensive, but by and large, one could attack the building sector, the industry sector, and the residential sector, as shown on the right, the pie chart on the right side, very efficiently in economic terms. So here I just list some of the limitations to allowing the market to decide how much energy efficiency it makes sense to do. We talked about one just a moment ago. Those who can afford it don't do it. Those who can't afford it want to do it, but don't have the means. There are other issues. I'll never forget, I went out to visit with several customers to talk about, gee, why aren't you spending more money in this area? And a target area I used were hospitals in New Jersey. Hospitals tend to have large buildings that are on campuses, and they stay there for decades. So the payback period of 10, 12 years for changing out an HVAC system is not a big deal. And I'll never forget sitting down with a hospital president of a fairly sophisticated system in the eastern part of the United States. And I asked, why aren't you doing this? And very respectfully and politely, the president of that hospital embarrassed the heck out of me. Fortunately, I was the only one in the room. He simply said to me, okay, so let's have a conversation about that, Ralph. I have $5 million in discretionary capital I can spend. And I am going to now ask you some questions. I said, fine, go ahead and ask away. He says, heaven forbid you have somebody who you love and is near and dear to you, and they have a need for medical attention. Do you choose where to send them based upon the BTUs and kilowatt hours per square foot that are used by that entity? Or do you choose them based upon the mortality rate of the surgeon, the quality of the care that others have told you they've received there? And of course, the answer is the latter. So $5 million of discretionary income is not going to go to improving by 10, 20, or 30% the energy consumption of my HVAC system. It's going to go to the best medical equipment to get the best doctors. And that example is true whether you're talking to university presidents, landlords of large buildings, or in fact, homeowners. The opportunity cost associated with making the investment in energy efficiency is simply too big. So in conclusion, I hope I've painted a picture of what I believe to be a fairly interesting industry in terms of this connection with things that we can do through public policy, things that we can do through the market, and things that we can do through technology. But they are a complicated set of issues. I really congratulate you. Nobody fell out of their seat out of sheer boredom. Sometimes when we have these conversations with people, their eyes glaze over and they wonder, oh my gosh, how can anybody get excited over this? But it is nonetheless an area that we believe can use the attention of bright students such as those that are here at Penn and other institutions such as yourself. So with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions.
Time for questions. Right here.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Aside from the decreasing number of power plants, why would you say the future of nuclear power in the U.S. is in question? Is it a matter of economics or public perception? Do you think like a carbon tax would maybe provide like a bounce back to nuclear?
Yeah, so I think there are a variety of reasons. To take your question, which have multiple parts in reverse order, the answer is yes, a carbon tax would be very helpful. You would need a carbon tax of about $30 to $50 per ton. It depends upon what type of size nuclear plant you're building. You need closer to $50 per ton if you were building a small modular reactor, closer to $30 a ton if you're building a large plant. I think a carbon tax is long overdue. I was encouraged by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that just came out of the UN this past weekend, and the fact that the most recent Nobel Prize went to a Yale professor yesterday who talked about the benefits of a carbon tax. I have zero confidence that we'll see a carbon tax anytime in the near future. The other important reason why I think nuclear has some obstacles is we have not addressed the disposal of the long-term waste. And that is a highly radioactive, dangerous source of waste that needs to be managed. As a former engineer, I no longer pretend to be able to do engineering. There's no doubt in my mind that that can be managed safely, but nonetheless, absent the political will to find a long-term repository. Right now, basically what we're doing is that we're storing it in secure containers on pads at our facilities. So why would you build new nuclear plants unless you've addressed that problem? So the economics and the absence of carbon and the absence of a long-term solution for the waste disposal, I think, are the two biggest problems for nuclear going forward. Yes?
Over here again.
In terms of the levelized cost of electricity, so you mentioned how when there's sort of coal and natural gas doesn't account for externalities, and that could be difficult to take into account because of the policies and the carbon tax. But in terms of storage, it seems like that might be easier because that would be more up to the private industry and look at the cost of storage. Have you guys included that in models and seen how that compares to the benefit for you?
Yes. So right now, storage is about $3 million a megawatt, a couple $100 per kilowatt hour. You need that to get down into the tens of dollars per kilowatt hour at current wind and energy PV prices. So it is sort of an interesting study, though, where the market kind of was, I think, maybe looking the wrong direction. The amount of effort that's been put into consumer device battery storage and transportation battery storage is enormous, because there's a perception that the market is enormous for that. But if you think about the technical limitations of mobile devices and consumer devices, it's small, you have to do heat dissipation, it has to be light, energy density has to be enormous. That is really tough. You think about the technical limitations of putting a battery in a substation, who cares how much it weighs? Who cares how big it is, right? It should be much easier. But the fact of the matter is, until renewable prices come down, the connection of the two, so even if you did batteries at zero, you still just barely have competitive power supply. So I think this is a little bit of a chicken and an egg. As renewable prices come down, then people will pay more attention to battery storage, and then people will pay more attention to renewables, and we'll get where we need to go.
Okay. Well, maybe here and then.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's just a perfect follow-up to that. So the price of storage technologies, and that's been coming down.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think it's about 8 to 12% a year, depending on.
Has it been that much? Yeah.
So if you follow that to its logical conclusion, some of the problems, challenges that you're articulating might actually be solved by just that.
That's correct.
Waiting for technology to play itself.
I think that's true. What I fear the most is that look, the number one culprit from a carbon point of view is coal, right? It's a ton of carbon per megawatt hour. And we got a great benefit from natural gas, cutting that in half. But that's not the final answer. I would just hate to see us prematurely retire nuclear plants because there is tremendous economic pressure on them by virtue of the low cost of natural gas, and think that at current technology we can replace nuclear with solar and wind, right? I mean, the average capacity factor of a solar farm is about 20%. So you not only have to build 4.5 times as much solar capacity, but you have to have the battery storage to then complement that production so that you can match the 92% capacity factor of solar. Wind is better. In viable areas, capacity factors of wind is about 40%. When I say capacity factor, that means what percentage of time is it running?
One other thing, again, related to storage. So you talk about energy generation, production, and storage, but what about transmission? So some of the outliers in your chart were Canada, US, Brazil, and Australia, all large countries having to. So this idea of having a few power plants and then serving a whole bunch of customers across the country, that's challenging, right? So
Yeah.
How do those costs factor in?
Yeah, so I didn't show cost, right? I showed electricity consumption per person. So I don't know the cost of electricity in Brazil. I would think in Canada it's quite expensive for many of the reasons you just mentioned. Although Canada does have some indigenous fuel supply that they are not afraid of using. They have the tar sands and natural gas that comes from there in the west, and then they just have deep drilling for natural gas in the east, and a fair amount of hydro in both parts of the country. To be sure, a highly distributed population does involve expensive technology for transmission and distribution. Interestingly enough, when you travel to Europe, as I'm sure you do all the time, you don't see wires above ground, right? Everything is underground, but that's where you have very compact population centers. If you travel around places like New Jersey, it looks like just a massive sloppy extension cord that's being run around telephone poles, but that is less expensive than running it underground. So yes, the cost of electricity would be higher for rural populations where you have long runs. It's only recently that distributed supply has come down enough where it might offset some of those costs. So in developing nations, sub-Saharan Africa, you should not be building a transmission and distribution grid, right? You should be relying upon distributed photovoltaics and distributed wind.
Maybe one last question with Lisa, and then we'll wrap up.
Great talk. So I'm curious because PSEG are very safety-oriented, and with the new meter sets being installed and in light of what's happened in Massachusetts, what are the features being designed into the meter sets, or is that research going on? So thinking of a fire as smart shut-off.
Right. So are you referring to the incident that with the 8,000 homes and the gas explosions? Okay, so I have to be careful because I don't have all the facts, all right? And I don't want to cast aspersions where I don't have all the facts. But we did send 50 people up there to see what was going on. So, and I was worried, right? So let me draw some analogies and some differences. What happened in Massachusetts was a very old gas pipe system made of cast iron exploded. And it actually kind of flared aggressively rather than kind of boom. It just, but nonetheless, from a safety point of view, they're equally terrifying. We have in PSEG the largest cast iron main system anywhere in America. So when I heard that, I said, oh, let's understand this, right? I have always been comforted by the fact that our cast iron gas main system only operates at low gas pressures. Theirs was supposed to be operating at a low gas pressure. I said, ooh, a second similarity that doesn't make me happy. Third similarity is that all of these systems, regardless of what pressure they operate at when they get to the home, are fed by a collection station we call metering and regulation stations that are high pressure. Third similarity. So when we went up there to say, okay, what happened at your metering station that you fed high pressure gas into your low pressure system? That is a human error that is possible for us, and it happened with them. And the answer is they did not have pressure relief valves on their distribution system. That is a fundamental design flaw that I don't understand if my facts are correct. We do have copious numbers of pressure relief valves throughout the distribution system, so that if somebody turns the valve the wrong way, it's not as simple as that. In the metering and regulating station, which is getting gas off the interstate system and feeds it at the wrong pressure to the low pressure system, that basically what you would have is a bunch of customers calling us up and saying, I smell gas outside in the street. Can you send somebody out here? And we would pick that up very, very quickly.
All right. So we're going to have some closing remarks, but just before we do that, let's thank Ralph one more time.
On behalf of the school, I'd like to present to you a token of appreciation. If you
Sure.
get maybe you can take a picture. We're going to document this with a high resolution latest technology. So it says, presented with deep appreciation to Ralph Izzo, Technology Business and Government Lecture Series, October 9, 2018. Thank you very much for such a wonderful talk.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Yeah, well, you have it.
No, it's here. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, no, it's
fact.